When you refuse to break the silence, something powerful happens inside the avoidant that most people never see. On the surface, they appear calm, detached, and unaffected, but internally, the silence removes their usual escape routes. There are no texts to analyze, no reassurance to lean on, no emotional pressure coming from you. And without those distractions, they're left alone with the very feelings they've been running from. Avoidant behavior isn't about lack of emotion, it's about emotional overload. They learned long ago that closeness feels unsafe, overwhelming, or unpredictable. So when feelings start growing, their instinct is to create distance. Silence from you, however, flips the script. Instead of them choosing distance, the distance simply exists. And because you're not chasing, explaining, or reacting, they can't frame themselves as the one in control anymore. At first, they expect you to reach out. They assume you'll try to fix things, ask questions, or seek clarity. That expectation is comforting because it keeps them emotionally regulated. When that doesn't happen, discomfort sets in. The silence becomes loud. Their mind starts filling the gaps, replaying moments of connection, wondering why you didn't follow the usual pattern. Curiosity slowly replaces relief. With nothing external to focus on, suppressed emotions rise to the surface. Thoughts they pushed aside begin resurfacing. The way you made them feel understood, the sense of ease in your presence, the attraction they didn't want to acknowledge. Silence acts like a mirror, forcing them to face those feelings without interference. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. Part of them wants closeness, reassurance, and connection. Another part wants safety through distance. When you remain silent, you don't feed either side, and that neutrality creates tension. Tension leads to awareness. Awareness leads to emotional processing they can't avoid. Many people misunderstand this moment and think silence equals indifference. It doesn't. Indifference shuts emotions down, amplifies them, especially when it comes from someone who previously showed warmth, confidence, and consistency. Your absence doesn't make you forgettable, it makes you noticeable. By not breaking the silence, you communicate strength without saying a word. You show that you respect yourself, that you're not afraid of distance, and that your emotional stability doesn't depend on their response. That quiet confidence becomes the very thing they start to miss. And when they finally feel the weight of that absence, they don't feel relief. They feel the emotions they tried so hard to avoid. When you refuse to chase or break the silence, it quietly disrupts the avoidant sense of control. Avoidant individuals feel safest when they believe they are managing the distance, when they decide when to pull away and when to re engage. Control gives them emotional stability. But the moment you stop reacting, that sense of control begins to slip, and with it comes discomfort. At first, they assume the silence is temporary. They expect you to reach out, to ask what's wrong, or to try to reestablish connection. That expectation keeps them calm because it confirms a familiar dynamic. They withdraw, you pursue. But when days pass and you remain steady, something shifts internally. The pattern breaks. They're no longer leading the emotional direction, they're observing it unfold without their input. This loss of control creates unease. Without your emotional response, they don't know where they stand. And uncertainty is difficult for someone who relies on distance to regulate emotions. Your silence removes their ability to predict your behavior, and unpredictability triggers reflection. They start questioning whether they misjudged you, the connection, or the impact they had on you. As control fades, attention increases. They begin monitoring you more closely, replaying interactions, wondering why you didn't chase. The silence forces them to confront a possibility they hadn't considered, that you are emotionally independent. That realization can be unsettling because it challenges their belief that pulling away automatically gives them power. What unsettles them most isn't the distance itself, but the fact that you seem unaffected by it. You're not trying to regain leverage, you're not negotiating closeness, you're simply living your life. That calm independence disrupts their internal narrative and shifts the emotional balance. Without control, they start evaluating their decision to withdraw. They wonder if they moved too quickly, if they misunderstood the connection, or if their fear made them step back from something meaningful. The silence becomes a mirror reflecting their own behavior back them without judgment or confrontation. This internal questioning doesn't happen because you demanded clarity or pushed for answers. It happens because you didn't. By refusing to break the silence, you remove the emotional safety net they expected to be there. And without it, they have to sit with uncertainty, something they typically try to avoid. Eventually, the desire to regain control can surface as subtle outreach, a casual message, a reaction, or a low risk check. It isn't about reconnecting fully. It's about restoring emotional footing. They want to know if they still have access, if the dynamic is still familiar. By staying composed and unreactive, you shift the power dynamic without force. You don't take control, you release it. And that's what makes your silence so impactful. When silence stretches on and you don't step in to fill the gap, the avoidant mind doesn't go quiet, it gets louder. Without new messages or emotional input from you, their thoughts turn inward. Conversations replay in their head, moments get reanalyzed, and small details suddenly feel significant. This mental replay isn't accidental, it's the mind trying to make sense of something unresolved. Avoidants are used to emotional distance giving them relief. Normally, pulling away helps them shut feelings down, but when you don't pursue, explain, or react, the usual relief never comes. Instead of distraction, there's space. And in that space, memories of connection resurface. They start recalling how they felt around you, the ease, the laughter, the emotional safety they didn't expect to feel. Silence gives those memories room to grow. Without new interactions to dilute them, the mind keeps circling back to what's already there. They begin questioning their own behavior. Did they misread the situation? Did they pull away too soon? Why didn't you chase like they assumed you would? These questions shift the emotional narrative. What once felt manageable now feels unfinished. As they replay interactions, perception changes. Your calm response to distance begins to stand out. You're no longer just someone they stepped away from. You're someone who didn't collapse when they did. That alone increases perceived value. Emotional composure becomes rare when most people react from insecurity. The more they replay, the more contrast they feel. They compare you to past experiences where people chased, demanded answers, or pressured them emotionally. That comparison works in your favor. You become associated with peace instead of pressure, strength instead of anxiety. Even without contact, attraction quietly rebuilds through reflection. Reevaluation follows replay. They begin assigning new meaning to your behavior. Your silence no longer reads as indifference, it reads as confidence. And confidence is difficult to dismiss. The absence of validation forces them to decide what the connection meant to them rather than reacting to your pursuit. This internal processing is slow and private. You won't see it happening, but it's powerful because it's self generated. Feelings formed internally are stronger than feelings triggered by external pressure. By not interrupting the process, you allow their mind to do the work for you. Eventually, the replay reaches a point where curiosity turns into motivation. They feel the urge to check in to see if the connection is still accessible. That impulse doesn't come from fear alone, it comes from the value they've reconstructed in your absence. And all of it happens because you let silence speak. Most people assume that when an avoidant pulls away and silence sets in, they finally feel relief. They imagine the avoidant is calm, detached, and comfortable without emotional demands. But the truth is often the opposite. When you refuse to break the silence, it doesn't give them peace, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is far more unsettling to an avoidant than closeness ever was. Avoidants manage their emotions by controlling distance. When they create space, they expect the emotional intensity to drop, but that expectation relies on one key factor, that the other person reacts in a predictable way. When you don't chase, don't ask questions, and don't try to restore connection, the emotional system they rely on stops working. The distance exists, but it doesn't bring the relief they counted on. Instead of calm, they experience low level anxiety, not panic, but unease. Questions begin forming that they didn't want to ask themselves. Where do I stand now? Did I miscalculate? What if they're truly okay without me? These thoughts create emotional tension because the usual reassurance, your pursuit, is missing. Silence forces them to confront loss rather than closeness. Their fear isn't just about intimacy, it's also about abandonment. When you don't reach out, that fear quietly activates. The absence of pressure feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity creates discomfort. They're no longer reacting to closeness, they're reacting to the possibility of being forgotten. This anxiety isn't always conscious. It shows up as restlessness, checking your online presence, wondering about your life, or feeling a subtle urge to reconnect. They might tell themselves they enjoy the space, but their behavior reveals otherwise. Attention replaces detachment. What makes this moment powerful is that the anxiety comes from within. You didn't provoke it, you didn't demand reassurance, you simply stayed grounded. And because the feeling is self generated, it carries more weight. They can't blame you for it, they have to face it. The silence also removes emotional contrast. When there's no pursuit, no conflict, and no reassurance, they're left comparing how they feel now to how they felt when connection existed. And that comparison often favors connection. Distance without pressure isn't comforting, it's empty. As anxiety grows, the narrative shifts. Instead of thinking, I needed space, they start thinking, what if I lost something meaningful? That shift is subtle but significant. It moves them from avoidance into awareness. Silence doesn't chase them, it invites reflection. And in that reflection, fear of closeness often turns into fear of loss. Eventually, the silence reaches a point where it becomes impossible for the avoidant to ignore. The emotional tension builds just enough that they feel compelled to do something about it, but not in a direct or vulnerable way. Instead of openly expressing feelings or addressing the distance, they test the door quietly. This is where subtle outreach begins. The message is rarely obvious. It might be a short a casual question, a reaction to a story, or a comment that seems almost meaningless on the surface. But beneath that simplicity is a very specific intention. They're not trying to reconnect fully. They're checking whether access still exists. They want to know if you're still emotionally available without having to risk rejection or expose themselves. This behavior is driven by a need for safety. Avoidants don't like emotional leaps. They prefer small, low risk steps that give them information without forcing vulnerability. By reaching out in a minimal way, they protect themselves while testing whether the dynamic is still familiar and controllable. What happens next is critical. If you immediately rush in with excitement questions or emotional intensity, the test succeeds for them, but attraction weakens. You confirm that they still hold emotional leverage. The silence they felt anxiety about disappears, and with it, the curiosity that brought them back. But when you respond calmly, warmly, and without urgency, something different happens. You show that the door is open, but you're not standing in it waiting. This creates a sense of balance. They feel welcome without feeling powerful, safe without feeling in control. This moment reinforces everything they've been processing internally. Your emotional consistency tells them that closeness doesn't come with pressure, that connection with you won't trap them or overwhelm them, and that realization reduces fear more effectively than reassurance ever could. Often, after this first test, there will be another and then another. Each one carries slightly more investment, a longer message, a question with more intent, a suggestion to talk or meet. This gradual progression is how avoidants move toward connection cautiously but deliberately. What's important is that none of this happens because you chased or demanded clarity. It happens because you allowed space without disappearing emotionally. You stayed grounded, self respecting, and emotionally steady. When they test the door and find strength instead of neediness, curiosity instead of pressure, attraction has room to grow again. Let them knock softly and answer without stepping out of your frame. When you hold your ground and don't collapse emotionally, something profound happens inside the avoidant. Respect begins to grow. Not the loud, dramatic kind of respect that comes from confrontation, but the quiet, lasting kind that reshapes how they see you. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure. They're used to people reacting, chasing, demanding clarity, or trying to pull them closer when distance appears. When you don't do that, you stand out immediately. By staying composed, you communicate strength without asserting it. You show that your sense of self isn't shaken by silence or uncertainty. That steadiness sends a powerful message. Connection with you doesn't require emotional chaos. For someone who fears being overwhelmed or controlled, this is disarming in the best way. Respect grows because you demonstrate boundaries without force. You don't punish them with silence and you don't beg them to stay. You simply continue living your life with confidence and purpose. This balance is rare. Most people swing between neediness and withdrawal. You do neither, and that emotional maturity recalibrates how they perceive you. As respect builds, attraction changes quality. It becomes deeper, calmer, and more intentional. You're no longer just someone they felt chemistry with, you become someone they admire. Admiration is critical because it creates safety. It tells them that closeness with you won't result in loss of autonomy or emotional overwhelm. Another shift happens internally for them. They start associating you with emotional regulation. When things felt intense, you didn't escalate. When things went quiet, you didn't panic. That consistency builds trust, even in absence. Trust grows when behavior stays predictable under pressure. This respect also challenges their old patterns. They're used to emotional leverage. When that leverage doesn't work on you, they're forced to engage differently. They begin approaching connection more consciously instead of reactively. And conscious connection is where real intimacy begins. Importantly, you didn't earn this respect by playing games or pretending not to care. You earned it by genuinely being centered in yourself. That authenticity matters. Avoidants are highly attuned to emotional incongruence. Calm, that's real, feels safe. Calm that's performative feels threatening. Yours is real. When respect and safety replace fear, avoidance loses its grip. Attraction no longer feels dangerous, it feels grounding. And that's when they lean in, not because they're anxious, but because they want to stay grounded. Stay self respecting. Let your emotional strength speak for you.